I was not looking for anything private when I opened the laptop. That was the part I kept replaying afterward. Not snooping, not searching, just trying to print a recipe. Michael had left his laptop open on the dining room table while helping Ethan fix a bicycle tire outside. Rain tapped softly against the windows while I searched for the chicken soup recipe Sandra liked. Normal afternoon, normal family visit. At least that was what I believed. The document was already open when the screen brightened. White page, black text, simple title centered at the top. SIGNS Mom is Changing the World seemed to narrow instantly around those 4 words. Changing, not grieving, not aging. Changing. The kind of careful language people use when they are afraid to say something directly. My hands froze above the keyboard. For several long seconds, the only sound in the room was rain against the windows and Ethan laughing faintly outside. Then I looked lower. More emotional after dark, repeats stories more often lately. Seems overwhelmed in crowded places. Hesitates before answering sometimes. Less confident driving in heavy traffic, cold spread slowly through my chest. Not because any individual sentence sounded cruel, because together they formed something terrifying, a narrative. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. Different bullet points were written in different colors. Blue, black, green, multiple people, collaborative. The room suddenly felt too quiet, too warm, too small. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Sandra casually saying last month, "You seem really sharp in the mornings lately." Sharp again, always sharp. Better, worse. Performance language quietly replacing ordinary humanity. At the time I smiled weakly. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No. They had already been documenting fluctuations privately long before saying things aloud. Every memory rearranged itself differently again. Not concern, tracking. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. For months, I whispered internally, my children have been building a file about me. The thought made me physically ill. I kept reading. Gets flustered when plans change unexpectedly, seems more anxious alone, sometimes loses train of thought mid-sentence anxious alone. Interesting phrase, not lonely, not grieving, anxious. Symptom language quietly swallowing emotional reality again. Then another memory surfaced. The first winter after Richard died, when I cried unexpectedly during dinner because his chair sat empty. At the time Claire hugged me tightly. Now everything rearranged itself differently again. Not grief support, potential evidence. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. How many ordinary human moments had quietly stopped remaining ordinary inside my children's minds. The thought hollowed me completely. Then another bullet point stopped me cold. Defensive when memory concerns mentioned the room tilted slightly around me. Defensive, interesting word. Not hurt, not humiliated, defensive. Resistance itself quietly transformed into possible symptom language again. That was the trap. I suddenly understood why older adults sometimes stop protesting altogether. Because every emotional reaction risks becoming additional evidence. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 weeks earlier, telling Sandra, "I'm tired of everyone watching me." Sandra exchanging a glance with Michael afterward. At the time I thought nothing of it. Now everything rearranged itself differently again. Not concern, confirmation. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. Even awareness of being monitored had probably become part of the narrative. The thought nearly broke me. Outside, Ethan laughed again while rain moved softly across the windows. Normal family sounds. Yet suddenly, I felt like I had accidentally discovered secret meeting notes about my own decline. Then another memory surfaced. Richard forgetting movie titles constantly after 65. Everyone laughed affectionately. No documents, no collaborative observations, no hidden tracking systems, because middle-aged forgetfulness remains socially human. Elderly forgetfulness becomes emotionally predictive. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. My children no longer experienced me continuously. They experienced versions of me, sharp today, distracted tomorrow, better lately, more emotional recently. Fragmented identities quietly replacing the whole person sitting in front of them. That was the deepest wound underneath everything. Then the back door opened. Michael's footsteps crossed the kitchen tile casually. I looked up slowly from the glowing laptop screen and froze because the expression on my son's face was not anger. It was terror, real terror. Not because I invaded his privacy. Because finally, he understood I had seen how my family truly talked about me when I was not in the room. Then softly, almost pleadingly, he whispered, "Mom," I stared directly at him. "What exactly am I changing into?" Michael did not answer immediately. That silence told me everything. Rain moved softly against the windows, while Ethan's laughter drifted faintly through the backyard again. Normal family sounds. Yet suddenly, the dining room felt like a place where I no longer fully existed as myself, only as interpretation. Michael stepped slowly toward the table. "Mom," I looked directly at the glowing document screen. "What exactly am I changing into?" The question hung heavily between us, because suddenly both of us understood the same devastating thing. The document was not simply observations. It was a narrative of decline quietly being written in real time. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. Every bullet point sounded harmless individually. Together, they formed inevitability. That was the trap. Fear organizes ordinary humanity into patterns until patterns start sounding like destiny. Michael rubbed his forehead tiredly. "It's not what you think." There it was. The universal sentence people say right before confirming exactly what you fear. I laughed softly, brokenly. "The document is literally called, 'Signs Mom is Changing.'" The room stayed completely still. Because spoken aloud, the reality finally sounded impossible to soften. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Sandra saying casually, "You seem less confident driving lately." At the time, I assumed she worried after the Christmas traffic incident. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No, that sentence probably existed in this document before she ever said it aloud. Every memory rearranged itself differently again, not spontaneous concern. Narrative reinforcement. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. My children were no longer simply discussing me emotionally. They were building continuity, evidence linking to evidence. Patterns supporting patterns. That was the deepest humiliation underneath everything. Then Michael whispered softly, "We were trying to understand what was happening." Happening. Interesting word. Not grief, not aging. Happening. Clinical uncertainty quietly replacing ordinary humanity again. I stared back down at the screen. Repeats stories more often lately, more emotional after dark, hesitates before answering sometimes. Lately, more often, comparative language everywhere. Fear quietly measuring fluctuation instead of experiencing presence. Then another memory surfaced. Richard forgetting names constantly after 60. Nobody documented frequency. Nobody tracked progression. Because middle-aged forgetfulness remains socially ordinary, elderly forgetfulness becomes emotionally predictive. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. For months, I whispered internally, my children have been editing my humanity into a diagnosis. The thought hollowed me completely. Michael sat slowly across from me at the table. Rain tapped softly against the windows between stretches of silence. Then he whispered something that nearly broke me. After Dad died, every little thing started feeling important. There it was finally, perfect honesty, not cruelty, not manipulation, trauma. One devastating loss quietly teaching my children to emotionally scan every ordinary imperfection afterward, for signs another devastating loss might already be beginning. That did not erase the humiliation, but finally, it explained why fear entered every room before I did. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. The night Richard died, Michael whispering, "I should have noticed something was wrong." God help me. Maybe everything afterward truly began there, not with forgetfulness, not with repeated stories. Guilt, one devastating loss quietly convincing my children that vigilance equals love. That was the tragedy underneath everything. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. The document was never really about me. It was about my children trying desperately to feel less helpless. The thought settled heavily through my chest. Then I looked back toward the screen again. Defensive when concerns mentioned that one hurt most, because suddenly I understood something terrifying. Every emotional reaction I had lately probably reinforced the narrative instead of interrupting it. That was the trap. Once fear becomes interpretive framework, resistance itself starts sounding suspicious. I suddenly understood why older adults sometimes stop defending themselves altogether. Because eventually, every defense becomes evidence too. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 weeks earlier, telling Sandra, "I feel like everyone watches me now." Sandra becoming strangely quiet afterward. At the time, I thought she felt guilty. Now everything rearranged itself differently again. Not guilt, confirmation. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. My awareness of being observed had likely become another documented change. The thought nearly broke me. Michael whispered softly, "We never wanted to hurt you." I looked slowly toward him. I know, and that somehow made everything worse. No villains, no cruelty, just terrified love quietly transforming ordinary humanity into monitored behavior. Then another memory surfaced. Standing before family dinners, lately silently rehearsing names and stories. Not because I forgot them, because I was terrified of hesitation. God help me. I had already started performing stability instead of simply living naturally. That was the real tragedy. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to experience ordinary interaction like ongoing evaluation. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. And worse, part of me had already started believing the document emotionally too. That frightened me most of all. I remembered forgetting why I walked into the laundry room recently and instantly panicking afterward. Not because forgetting mattered, because suddenly I wondered whether it belonged in the file. That was the damage, ordinary humanity quietly becoming self-surveillance. Then I quietly admitted something devastating for the first time. "Do you know what this document did to me?" Michael looked up slowly. "It made me afraid to act human around all of you." Perfect silence answered me afterward, because there it was. The deepest wound underneath everything. Not observation, conditional humanity. Fear had quietly transformed family love into an environment where ordinary imperfection no longer felt emotionally safe. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not that people notice when you struggle. It is realizing how quickly fear can quietly transform ordinary human behavior into ongoing evidence. Once the people who love you become terrified, they might already be slowly losing you. Michael closed the laptop slowly after that, not defensively, carefully, as though shutting the screen might somehow soften what I had already seen. But the damage was no longer inside the document. It was inside my memories now. That was the tragedy. Every conversation from the past year suddenly rearranged itself differently. Not connection, observation. I sat motionless at the dining room table while rain moved softly against the windows. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Claire smiling brightly last month. You remembered that perfectly. At the time I thought she sounded encouraging. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No, she sounded relieved. Every memory rearranged itself differently again. Not affection, performance assessment. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. For months, I whispered internally, my family has been emotionally grading me. The thought hollowed me completely. Michael sat across from me silently, not angry, not defensive, ashamed. That somehow made everything sadder, because suddenly I realized my children genuinely believed the document proved how deeply they cared. No cruelty, no manipulation. Just terrified love quietly transforming into surveillance. Then another memory surfaced. Richard forgetting appointments constantly after 65. Everyone teased him affectionately. No files. No pattern tracking. No hidden collaborative documents. Because middle-aged forgetfulness remains socially human, elderly forgetfulness becomes emotionally predictive. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. Then Michael whispered softly, "We thought writing things down would help us stay objective." Objective again, always objective. Not compassionate, not trusting, objective. Fear always reaching for systems because systems feel safer than uncertainty. I stared toward the rain-darkened backyard. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. The document never actually reduced anyone's fear. It fed it. Every new observation strengthened the narrative. Every ordinary lapse gained emotional significance. Every hesitation quietly reinforced anticipation. Fear feeds beautifully on documentation. That was the trap. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Standing in front of the bathroom mirror before family dinners, lately silently reviewing names, appointments, and recent conversations. Not because I forgot them. Because I was terrified of hesitation. God help me. I had already started rehearsing humanity before entering rooms. That was the real tragedy. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to perform normality constantly around the people they love most. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. And worse, part of me had already started seeing myself through the document too. That frightened me most of all. I remembered forgetting where I placed scissors last week and instantly panicking afterward. Not because losing scissors mattered. Because suddenly I wondered whether it counted as evidence. Ordinary human moments no longer remained ordinary inside my own mind either. That was the damage. Self-surveillance. Then Michael whispered softly, "We didn't know how to stop worrying." There it was finally, perfect truth, not control, not manipulation, trauma. One devastating loss quietly teaching my children that ordinary life could collapse without warning. After Richard died, every small imperfection started sounding emotionally dangerous. That did not erase the humiliation, but finally it explained why fear entered every room before I did. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. The night Richard died. Michael sitting in the hospital hallway whispering, "I should have noticed something sooner." God help me. Maybe everything afterward truly began there, not with forgetfulness. Not with repeated stories. Guilt. One devastating loss quietly convincing my children that vigilance equals love. That was the tragedy underneath everything. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. The document was not really tracking my decline. It was tracking my children's fear. The thought settled heavily through my chest. Then I looked slowly toward Michael. "Do you know what hurts most?" He stayed silent. "You stopped letting ordinary humanity stay ordinary." Perfect silence filled the room afterward. Because there it was, the deepest wound underneath everything. Not aging, interpretation. Every repeated story became meaningful. Every emotional moment became suspicious. Every hesitation quietly transformed into future possibility. Fear had quietly contaminated proportion itself. Then another memory surfaced. Richard telling the same fishing story every Thanksgiving for 20 years. Nobody tracked frequency. Nobody quietly compared versions afterward, because middle-aged repetition remains comforting. Elderly repetition becomes emotionally loaded. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. Rain tapped softly against the windows, while exhaustion spread heavily through my chest. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. My children no longer experienced me continuously. They experienced versions. Sharp today, distracted lately, more emotional recently. Fragmented identities quietly replacing the whole person sitting in front of them. That was the deepest humiliation underneath everything. Then Michael whispered something that nearly broke my heart. "I miss when talking to you felt easy." The sentence settled heavily through the room, because there it was, perfect honesty. The monitoring had not only changed me, it changed everyone. No spontaneity, no harmless forgetfulness, no ordinary imperfection. Everything emotionally filtered through fear now. Then another realization surfaced slowly. And maybe that was why the document hurt so deeply. Not because my children feared losing me, because they stopped trusting ordinary humanity to remain harmless. Every mistake became possibility. Every pause became evidence. Every emotional moment quietly transformed into warning signs. I stared toward Richard's photograph glowing softly beneath the hallway light. Then quietly whispered, "I miss being allowed to just be a grieving person instead of a developing problem." Michael cried silently across the table. Because finally, he understood the actual damage underneath everything, not the document itself, the quiet erosion of unconditional humanity. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not that people notice when you struggle. It is realizing how quickly fear can quietly transform ordinary human behavior into an unfolding narrative. Once the people who love you become terrified, they might already be slowly losing you. After I found the document, family dinners became unbearable. Not because anyone argued, because everyone tried too hard to sound normal afterward. That was the damage. Once hidden observation becomes visible, every ordinary interaction starts feeling contaminated by awareness. Sandra smiled too quickly. Claire watched her words carefully. Michael looked guilty every time I paused before answering something. Not intentionally, perhaps, but fear had already trained everyone to interpret silence. That hurt more than anger would have. Rain tapped softly against the dining room windows while Ethan colored dinosaurs beside the table. Normal family evening. Normal dinner. Yet suddenly, I felt like I was sitting inside a meeting about myself instead of inside my own family. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Last Easter, forgetting the name of a restaurant during conversation. At the time, Sandra gently filled it in for me. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No. That moment probably became another bullet point afterward. Everything rearranged itself differently again. Not help, documentation. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. For months, I whispered internally, ordinary moments have quietly stopped ending when they happen. They continued afterward inside private analysis. That was the humiliation. Then Ethan looked up suddenly. "Grandma," I smiled automatically. "Yes, sweetheart. Mom says you're having more good days lately." The room froze instantly, perfect silence. Cold spread slowly through my chest. Good days again, always good days. Bad days, sharp days, distracted days. Fear constantly fragmenting my humanity into emotional categories. I stared slowly toward Sandra. Her face drained of color immediately, because finally she understood something devastating too. The language had already spread downward into another generation. Then another memory surfaced. Richard forgetting movie endings constantly after 65. Nobody categorized him afterward. Nobody discussed whether it was a good day. Because middle-aged forgetfulness remains socially human, elderly forgetfulness becomes emotionally measured. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. Then Ethan whispered innocently, "What makes a bad day?" The room seemed to collapse inward slightly around those words. Sandra covered her mouth instantly. Michael stared down at his plate. Claire closed her eyes briefly, and suddenly I realized something devastating. My grandchildren were already learning to experience me conditionally too. Not simply grandma, variable grandma. Better today, worse tomorrow. Sharp right now. That hurt more than the document itself. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. The tracking had already become family culture. Not hidden, not occasional, normal. I looked gently toward Ethan. "Everybody has hard days sometimes." He nodded thoughtfully. "But Mom says yours are important." Important, not sad, not difficult. Important, emotionally loaded, monitored, interpreted. The tears stung unexpectedly behind my eyes. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. The first winter after Richard died, when I cried constantly at night. At the time, Claire hugged me and said grief comes in waves. Now everything rearranged itself differently again. Not grief support, pattern recognition. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. How many ordinary emotional moments had quietly become predictive data inside my children's minds. The thought hollowed me completely. Sandra whispered sharply toward Ethan, "Finish your dinner." Too quickly, too nervously. Fear always revealing itself through urgency eventually. Then another memory surfaced. Standing before family dinners, lately silently reviewing names and stories in the bathroom mirror. Not because I forgot them, because I was terrified of feeding the narrative accidentally. God help me. I had already started performing stability instead of simply living naturally. That was the real tragedy. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to experience ordinary interaction like ongoing evaluation. Then Michael quietly admitted something that nearly broke me. We didn't realize Ethan was hearing all this. There it was, perfect honesty, not cruelty, not manipulation, normalization. The fear had become so emotionally embedded inside the family that nobody noticed how naturally everyone now spoke about me as fluctuating instead of whole. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. The document had not only changed how my children saw me, it changed how they described me, and language eventually shapes reality. Good days. Bad days, changing. Different lately. Little by little, ordinary humanity quietly disappearing beneath interpretation. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Richard disappearing into the garage for hours after difficult days, listening to baseball games on the radio. Nobody documented mood shifts. Nobody tracked emotional fluctuation. Because middle-aged solitude remains personality, elderly solitude becomes emotionally suspicious. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. Rain moved softly across the windows while exhaustion spread heavily through my chest. Then I quietly asked, "Do you know what frightens me most now?" Nobody answered. "That one day I'll forget something ordinary." My voice cracked slightly, "and everyone will already know where it belongs in the story." Perfect silence filled the room afterward. Because there it was, the deepest wound underneath everything. Not observation, narrative inevitability. Fear had quietly transformed ordinary humanity into unfolding evidence. Then another realization surfaced slowly. And worse, part of me had already started believing the story emotionally too. That frightened me most of all. I remembered losing my train of thought briefly last week and instantly panicking afterward. Not because forgetting mattered, because suddenly I wondered whether it confirmed something. God help me. I had already started seeing myself through their fear. That was the real tragedy underneath everything. Not aging, internalized interpretation. Then Sandra whispered softly, "We were just scared." I looked slowly toward her. "I know, and somehow that made everything sadder. No villains, no cruelty. Just terrified love quietly replacing unconditional humanity with constant emotional analysis. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not that people notice when you struggle. It is realizing how quickly fear can quietly transform ordinary family, love, into narrative surveillance. Once the people who love you become terrified, they might already be slowly losing you. A few days later, I stopped telling my children certain things, not dramatically, quietly. That frightened me, not because I wanted secrets. Because suddenly ordinary honesty no longer felt emotionally safe. That was the damage. Once people begin documenting your humanity, you start editing yourself around them automatically. I noticed it constantly afterward, not mentioning when I misplaced my keys briefly, not admitting when grief made me distracted. Stopping stories halfway through if I worried I already told them before, not because those things mattered, because suddenly I imagined them entering the document. Repeated story again, forgot where she left keys, seemed distracted today, God help me. I had started living defensively. That was the real tragedy. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to monitor themselves harder than anyone else ever could. Rain tapped softly against the windows while I stood alone in the kitchen washing dishes one evening. Richard's old jazz records played quietly from the living room, normal house sounds. Yet suddenly, even solitude felt emotionally crowded somehow. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Last month, telling Sandra, "I've been crying more at night lately." At the time, she hugged me gently. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No, that probably became more emotional after dark. Everything rearranged itself differently again. Not support, translation. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. My children no longer simply listened to me emotionally. They interpreted me diagnostically. That was the deepest humiliation underneath everything. Then the phone rang. Michael. For one horrible second, panic flashed through me automatically. Not because I feared him, because suddenly every conversation carried invisible observation underneath it. I answered carefully. Too carefully. Again. Michael noticed immediately. "You sound tired." Tired. Interesting word. Not hurt. Not exhausted. Tired. Every ordinary human emotion now quietly sounding clinically relevant somehow. I closed my eyes briefly. Long day. Then silence lingered softly between us. And suddenly I realized something devastating. I no longer trusted pauses around my children. That was the damage. Every silence felt interpreted. Every hesitation felt measured. Every emotional reaction quietly carried possible meaning. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Richard forgetting appointments constantly after 65. Everyone teased him affectionately. No documents, no pattern tracking, no narrative building, because middle-aged forgetfulness remains socially human. Elderly forgetfulness becomes emotionally predictive. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. Then Michael whispered softly, "I deleted the document." Deleted. Interesting word. Not ended this. Not stopped seeing me that way. Deleted. The file disappeared. The framework remained. That was what frightened me most. Sharp today, more emotional lately, distracted tonight. Fear had already trained everyone to interpret me through fluctuation instead of continuity. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. And worse, part of me had already internalized that framework too. That frightened me most of all. I remembered forgetting why I walked upstairs recently and instantly panicking afterward. Not because forgetting mattered, because suddenly I wondered what category it belonged in. That was the damage, ordinary humanity quietly becoming self-evidence. Then Michael whispered something that nearly broke my heart. "I miss when conversations with you felt natural." The sentence settled heavily through the quiet kitchen, because there it was. Perfect truth. The monitoring had not only changed how my family saw me, it changed how I existed around them, less spontaneous, more careful, constantly self-editing. Fear had quietly stolen ordinary humanity from all of us. Then another memory surfaced. Standing before family dinners, lately silently rehearsing stories in the bathroom mirror. Not because I forgot them, because I was terrified of repetition. God help me. I had already started performing cognitive safety instead of simply living naturally. That was the real tragedy underneath everything. Not aging, self-erasure. Then Michael whispered softly, "We thought paying closer attention meant loving you better." There it was finally. Perfect honesty, not control, not manipulation. Fear, one devastating loss quietly teaching my children that vigilance equals devotion. That illusion poisoned everything slowly afterward. Because vigilance cannot stop grief. Observation cannot guarantee permanence. Documentation cannot protect people from loss, yet fear still reaches for those things anyway. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. The document never actually made my children feel safer. It only taught everyone to live inside constant anticipation of decline instead of inside ordinary family life. That was the tragedy. Fear feeds beautifully on interpretation. Then I quietly admitted something devastating for the first time. "Do you know what I miss most?" Michael stayed silent. "Making mistakes without feeling like they mean something." Perfect silence answered me afterward, because there it was, the deepest wound underneath everything, not observation itself. meaning assigned to observation. Every repeated story became evidence. Every emotional moment became narrative support. Every ordinary lapse quietly transformed into future prediction. I stared toward Richard's photograph, glowing softly beneath the hallway light. Then another realization surfaced slowly. And maybe that was why the document hurt so deeply. Not because my children feared losing me, because they stopped trusting ordinary humanity to remain harmless. Then Michael cried softly through the phone. Because finally he understood the actual damage underneath everything, not the document itself, the quiet loss of emotionally safe imperfection. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not that people notice when you struggle. It is realizing how quickly fear can quietly transform ordinary human behavior into unfolding evidence. Once the people who love you become terrified, they might already be slowly losing you. The strangest part was what happened after the document disappeared. Nothing changed immediately. That was what hurt most. No more files, no more bullet points. Yet the fear remained alive inside the family anyway. I noticed it in tiny moments. Sandra looking relieved when I remembered appointments. Claire watching me carefully when I lost my train of thought briefly. Michael pausing too long after I repeated a story accidentally. Not cruelty, conditioning. Fear had already trained everyone's nervous systems to scan me automatically. That was the damage. Rain moved softly against the windows one Sunday evening while the family gathered for dinner again. Normal table, normal food, normal voices, yet suddenly I realized something devastating. Everyone was trying not to monitor me now. And that effort itself revealed how deeply the monitoring had already become part of family life. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Richard telling the same fishing story every Thanksgiving for 20 years. Nobody exchanged glances afterward. Nobody mentally noted repetition, because middle-aged repetition remains comforting. Elderly repetition becomes emotionally loaded. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. Ethan sat coloring quietly beside the table. Then suddenly he looked up and asked, "Grandma, are you still changing?" The room froze instantly, perfect silence. Cold spread slowly through my chest, changing again, always changing. Different lately, better today, fear constantly turning humanity into progression. Sandra looked horrified immediately. "Ethan," but I gently raised my hand. "No, sweetheart," I said softly. "I'm still me, still me." The words settled heavily through the room, because suddenly everyone realized something devastating at the same time. For months now, the family had quietly spoken about me like an unfolding situation instead of a whole person. Then another memory surfaced. Standing in front of the bathroom mirror, lately rehearsing names and stories before family dinners. Not because I forgot them, because I was terrified of feeding the narrative accidentally. God help me, I had already started shaping myself around fear. That was the real tragedy. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to experience ordinary humanity like something requiring management. Then Ethan frowned thoughtfully. "But Mom says everyone changes when they get older." There it was, the real emotional confusion underneath everything. Not fear of aging itself, fear of what aging might eventually mean. I smiled gently toward him. "Everyone changes their whole lives," I said softly. "That's different from disappearing." The room stayed completely still afterward, because there it was, perfect truth. The deepest wound underneath everything. My children had quietly started confusing ordinary human change with possible erasure. That was the tragedy. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. The night Richard died, Michael whispering, "I should have noticed something sooner." God help me. Maybe everything afterward truly began there. One devastating loss quietly poisoning the family's relationship with uncertainty itself. After that, every ordinary imperfection sounded dangerous. Every emotional moment became loaded. Every forgotten detail quietly carried catastrophic possibility. That did not erase the humiliation. But finally, it explained why fear entered every room before I did. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. The document was never really about memory. It was about helplessness. My children desperately trying to organize uncertainty into something trackable, something understandable, something preventable. That was everything. Then Michael quietly admitted something that nearly broke my heart. I think we stopped seeing you in the present. The sentence settled heavily through the dining room. Because finally, he understood the actual damage underneath everything. Not observation, future obsession. Fear had quietly pulled everyone out of ordinary life and trapped them inside anticipation instead. Sharp today, more emotional lately, repeating things again. Nobody simply experienced moments anymore. They interpreted them. Then another memory surfaced. Richard sitting alone in the garage listening to baseball games after difficult days. Nobody documented emotional shifts. Nobody categorized behavior, because middle-aged sadness remains personality. Elderly sadness becomes emotionally suspicious. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. Rain tapped softly against the windows, while exhaustion spread heavily through my chest. Then another realization surfaced slowly. And maybe that was why the document hurt so deeply. Not because my children feared losing me, because they quietly stopped trusting ordinary humanity to remain ordinary. Every pause became meaningful. Every mistake became narrative support. Every emotional moment quietly transformed into possible evidence. Fear had quietly contaminated proportion itself. Then Michael looked toward me with tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry we made you feel like a problem we were tracking." Problem. The word nearly broke me completely, because there it was. The deepest humiliation underneath everything. Not aging, becoming interpretable instead of simply loved. Then I reached across the table and squeezed his hand gently. Not because the damage disappeared, because finally everyone understood its shape. No villains, no cruelty, just terrified love quietly replacing unconditional humanity with constant interpretation. Later that night, after everyone left, I stood alone beside the rain-darkened kitchen window while Richard's photograph rested softly beneath the hallway light. No documents, no bullet points, no observations, just silence, human silence, and suddenly I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not that people notice when you struggle. It is realizing how quickly fear can quietly transform ordinary human behavior into an unfolding story. Once the people who love you become terrified, they might already be slowly losing you.